Zach, did you have a thing? Okay. All right. So yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Joseph Hammer. I'm an associate professor of counseling psychology here at the University of Kentucky. And with me is Zach Clements, an advanced doctoral student in our counseling psych program. And so I'm so glad that you're here. We look forward to, in the first half of this presentation, answering the most common questions people have about our specialty of counseling psych. And then after that, we're going to spend the rest of the time on Q&A, which will be a lot of fun. So in terms of some etiquette rules, please stay on mute. Please keep your cameras off for the duration. You are welcome at any time to post the questions you have into the chat. We just won't start answering them until we get to the Q&A in the end. But if you have a question, you're ready to pop it in the chat, go ahead and we'll look to go through the questions as we go, or you can save your questions. So we'll say more about that when we get to the Q&A. But first, let's dive into these most common questions that folks have. So what is counseling psych and what can I do with various degrees in counseling psych? Counseling psych is one of several specialties within professional psychology that maintains a focus on facilitating personal and interpersonal functioning across the lifespan. And the practice of counseling psych encompasses a broad range of culturally sensitive practices that help people improve their well-being, alleviate their distress and maladjustment, resolve crises, and increase their ability to function better in their lives. And with its attention to both normal developmental issues and problems associated with physical, emotional, and mental disorders, this specialization holds a unique perspective in the broader practice-based areas of psychology. So that's our boilerplate about what is counseling psych, and we'll unpack that some more as we go, of course. Counseling psych and clinical psych, most common question that we get. What's the difference? They have different historical roots, but these days they're more similar than different. And both counseling psych folks and clinical psych folks are trained or potentially trained to do a variety of things. It's one of the things I love, especially about the doctoral degree, is that we get to learn so many different things. We learn how to do social science research as psychologists. For those who want to go into a teaching-based career, we learn how to teach undergraduate students and or graduate students in psychology and within our specialty area. We learn how to do psychotherapy, talk therapy, sitting with someone, helping them unpack the issue that's bothering them and figuring out solutions through verbal dialogue. Psychological assessment and testing, that is using standardized batteries of questions or protocols or activities to help figure out important things about a person, like the nature of their intelligence and forms of intelligence, different aspects of their personality, their neurological development, their career interests, their prior history of PTSD, anything we think we can measure, we seek to do testing around. And that is a unique thing for psychology as a doctoral level profession. So we learn how to do psychological assessment and testing. We learn how to provide clinical supervision, which is when you are a novice clinician learning to do this stuff, you need to be supervised by more advanced people. Those people are called clinical supervisors. So me as a professor, I provide a lot of clinical supervision, helping train people in how to become great therapists. And I really enjoy it. So that's what clinical supervision is. And then consultation is providing your expertise and advice to organizations, groups, or individuals about how they can improve or help their organization improve. Outreach, you know what that is. Counseling center on your campus probably does outreach about various mental health topics. And then advocacy is something that we do by ourselves or with other groups of people or organizations to work towards creating more equity in our world when it comes to medicine, policing, health and wellness, housing, where we're looking to address systems of oppression and dismantle them. So counseling psychologists and clinical psychologists in programs can learn how to do all of these things. And they go into careers that can use some of these things or not other things, depending on what their preferences are. Both counseling psych and clinical psych folks get licensed as psychologists in all 50 states and many territories. We're both trained in mainline psychotherapy treatments like CBT. Both types of psychologists see clients with a variety of presenting concerns and demographic backgrounds. and were both employed in a variety of work settings. When I talk about work settings, here's some examples. Academic departments, if you want to become a professor or do research at a university, you'd work in an academic department probably. If you want to practice talk therapy and some assessment and do it on campus in a university counseling center, you can do that. If you want to go into independent, private, or group practice, providing clinical services to people, a lot of folks go on to do that in both clinical and counseling psych. Some psychologists work in Veterans Administration medical centers, which you commonly hear of as VAs, or correctional settings like prisons, or hospitals or other medical settings. And then, of course, community mental health agencies, nonprofit agencies that serve people in the community or specialized groups of people. So a lot of different work settings where you'll find both counseling and clinical psychologists. And so if you walk away from today with one thing, it's that counseling psych and clinical psych are more similar than they are different. I really want that to sink in because it's a huge misunderstanding that people have. And I should say too, that I have a reasonably well-informed opinion about stuff, but this is just my take. And so of course, ask your other mentors and other people for their thoughts on these questions, right? This is just my experience and that's my disclaimer, right? So I won't pretend to know what the absolute truth is. This is just what I believe I've learned about these professions. Now that being said, they're similar, but there's some on average differences, which some of these won't matter to you. Some of them may matter very much. On counseling psych, we focus a lot on diversity, equity, inclusion, centering that in all the type of stuff that we do. We get training and we're very focused on social justice advocacy. We like taking a strengths-based approach to help people figure out what's going well for them and what they're good at and helping them to leverage that to address the things that are concerning. We pay attention to career and vocational issues, meaningful work, how to get people into jobs that feel good to them. And then prevention, helping to prevent stuff before it starts. There's plenty of clinical psychologists who do this stuff too, right? But on average, counseling psych heavily emphasizes these pieces. And on the other hand, clinical psych on average more heavily emphasizes more behavioral approaches to treatment, that assessment and testing type of activity that I talked about, a lot of good training in that they get, and more medical settings and hospital settings. That tends to be a strength and a focus. Counseling psych, we get a lot of experience with young adults, and outpatient populations. Whereas clinical psych may have a little bit more experience in some programs with child psych, with adults, just like counseling psychs do, and then adult inpatient treatment, inpatient settings. On average, clinical psychologists may have some more training in. Counseling psychologists work with people with a variety of degrees of psychopathology and severity of disorder, whereas clinical psych on average has a little bit more training on the heavier side of psychopathology, schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, that sort of stuff. And then in counseling centers, that particular setting is, you see a lot of counseling psych folks, and in hospitals and medical settings, you tend to see more clinical psych folks than counseling psych folks. So again, these are on average differences. And so if you're really attracted to certain of these pieces, then that's something to know. The biggest difference on those things on the last slide are from one program to another. So there can be two clinical psych programs that are way different on these attributes, and some counseling psych programs that are more similar to clinical psych programs than others. And so you want to apply on a program by program basis. If you're going for a psychology degree, a counseling or clinical psych degree, you want to consider both types of programs because some counseling psych programs are more like clinical psych programs and vice versa. So you want to consider both options. That's a key take home. Zach, do you want to speak to these parts?
So you want to avoid both programs for these reasons listed, especially if you don't want to be in grad school for 4 to 7 years. These programs have years of coursework, you have to take a practicum, and then there's an internship at the end. So it's a little bit longer than a PhD for maybe developmental psychology. You also don't just want to provide talk therapy to clients. There's a lot of master's programs, depending on the state you're in which you can provide talk therapy to clients as a licensed professional that don't require having a PhD or a PsyD. And so that's something really important if you're interested in only doing that versus doing research or integrating all of the things that come with this program.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so to build on what Zach was saying, many of you, I believe, you just want to get a grad degree and you want to be able to provide talk therapy to populations you care about. For many of you, you don't need a psych degree. You don't need a doctorate. You only need a counseling psych doctorate or a clinical psych doctorate. When I say doctorate, that's both PhD and PsyD, either of those, right? You only need to get that if you really want the perks that uniquely come with a doctoral degree versus a master's degree. So for many of you, I guarantee a bunch of you are going to go into social work programs, marriage and family therapy programs, or counseling programs, because you can do a 2 to 3 year master's degree, spend a little bit more time under supervision, and then get independently licensed in those professions. You don't have to be in grad school for as long as you do with counseling psych or clinical psych. And we can say more about that in the Q&A later.
And then if you're looking between the two, you should definitely avoid counseling psych if you don't want to emphasize DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion, in how you do your work. DEI is central to counseling psych. It's in our ethics. It's important to Division 17, which is APA's Counseling Psych Division. So if you're okay with having uncomfortable situations and have some cultural humility, then counseling psych is right for you. And if that's not something that you're open to yet or at all, then you might want to avoid counseling psych. And building on that, the second bullet point, if you are not open to having your beliefs challenged or willing to engage in uncomfortable conversations, you should also avoid counseling psych. So we're not asking you to be in a space that is really, really unsafe, but uncomfortable is the key word. There's a lot of pieces of awareness that we just all don't have. And so in counseling psych, we really try to make sure that we challenge each other and ourselves in order to have those uncomfortable conversations for our client and for our fields. And then the last one, research on topics that are not studied by counseling psych professors. And so Dr. Hammer has a really great resource that he'll send to you that has all the general topics that counseling psychologists tend to study. And they're usually social justice oriented, strengths-based. And while clinical tends to be, on neurocognitive testing, autism, or psychopathology. And of course, that's not for all programs, but there's some common themes in research in counseling psychology.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely like DI is important to everything we do, how we do our research, how we do our teaching, how we do our practice. And we really believe that you have to engage in personal development to become a really good therapist, because talk therapists are the tool of treatment. And so we have to be kind of right with ourselves and in tune with ourselves to be our best clinician self. And so there's a lot of personal growth involved in counseling psych programs, which I really like, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. Right. And then if you want to do research in topics as a PhD student, and you want to study certain things that are not typically studied by counseling psych professors, then yeah, clinical psych programs on average may be a better fit. So those are some things to, I think, help keep in mind about when counseling psych could be a good fit or not a good fit. Make sure. Okay, so we're going to speak about degree options. If you want to stop at the master's degree, provide talk therapy, and you live in a non-CACREP only state, then a 3-year counseling psych master's degree can be a good fit for you. Let me explain what I mean by that CACREP stuff. CACREP is an accrediting agency that accredits counseling programs. CACREP does not accredit psychology programs, including counseling psychology programs. I know it's confusing because counseling psychology has the word counseling in it, but counseling psych is a psych specialty. It's completely separate than the master's level profession of counseling. Therefore, if you want to get licensed as a counselor in a given state after just doing your master's, but that state's Board of Counseling has stated in their regulations that you may only get licensed as a counselor if you graduate from a CACREP accredited program, then you should not get a psychology master's degree. If, however, you live in a state where the Board of Counseling, which is most states currently, I should say, if you live in a state where the Board of Counseling of that state is willing to license counselors who were trained in a counseling master's program or a counseling psychology master's program. Then a 3-year counseling psych master's degree can be a good fit. And if you're not sure what state you'll end up in, but know that you will want the option potentially of becoming a licensed counselor, then you need to play it safe. And I would tell you, only go to a CACREP accredited counseling master's program. And yes, this is very complicated, and I'm very sorry that it is. So that's the deal with the master's degree. It's kind of nuanced. Now, if you want a PhD or PsyD and your CV is currently strong enough to apply directly to that, a PhD or PsyD in counseling psych, definitely apply to 4 to 7 year doctoral programs, whether it be PhD or PsyD. I'll talk about the difference between those two in just a second. If you want a PhD or PsyD, but your CV is not yet strong enough, which is the case for a lot of us, right, when we're in our bachelor's, then a 2-year counseling psych doctoral prep master's degree is a good fit. And this is where we do our little plug. By the way, the University of Kentucky's Counseling Psychology Doctoral Preparation Master's Program is something I highly recommend. Our program outcomes data from the last 3 years indicates that 100% of our master's students who applied to more than 2 PhD or PsyD programs, which, as you know, if you're going to apply to doctoral programs, you got to apply to several, right? The best practice is around 9. But 100% of these students were successful in obtaining offers of admission to PhD and or PsyD programs. In addition, for those of you thinking about the cost of graduate school, over 70% of our master's students received full-time funding, meaning that they did not have to pay for tuition or health insurance, and they received a monthly stipend to defray living expenses. And I'm the faculty director of this master's program. Love to answer your questions about it. The deadline to apply is February 1st, so please consider applying. So that's our little plug. So if you're in this last category here, you know you want to go doctorate, but you're not quite yet there, our program, I think, is a really good fit. We have an excellent track record. So I promised to talk about PhD versus PsyD. A PhD degree comes in 2 training model flavors: the scientist practitioner, which is about 90% of programs, or the clinical scientist model, which is very heavily focused on research, where scientist practitioner programs have somewhat of a balance of both learning to be really good at doing research, probably some teaching experience, and also learning how to be excellent practitioners. So we become both good researchers and practitioners. And that's why it takes 4 to 7 years, because it's 2 robust skill sets we have to learn. The tough thing about PhD programs, as you probably have heard, it's really tough to get in. On average, a given program only accepts 8% of people who apply. 100 people apply, they'll only accept 8 of them, right? Tough to get in. But the cool thing about a PhD, and this applies to both counseling psych and clinical psych, by the way, is that the majority of PhD students are fully funded in that way I was talking about earlier. The tuition fully waived, you get the stipend, et cetera. And because of that, they go into less debt. The median debt for graduates from PhD programs in counseling and or clinical psych is $50K. You get more personalized training because of smaller class sizes. It tends to be 5 to 7 years, a bit longer. In contrast, the PsyD uses a practitioner scholar model, which is 90% focused on practice. You learn just enough about research to be good consumers of it, to understand it and apply it to your practice, not to be a scientist yourself. And that's why it takes a little less time generally, more like 4 to 5 years. It's a lot easier to get into. The average PsyD program accepts about half of the people who apply. So statistically, you apply to 3 PsyD programs and your CV is decent, chances are you're going to get in at least one place. The downside, though, is that very few PsyD students are funded. And what that means is that they go into triple-digit debt on average. And you have larger class sizes, less personal attention. So pros and cons of the PhD, right? Because so many people tell me, I want to get a doctorate for the prestige and stuff. And I just want to go and provide talk therapy after my doctorate. Technically, the PsyD is the best fit, but the downside is it's kind of expensive. And so you'll see plenty of people get into PhD programs because they like research enough and have strong enough CVs for it so that they can get that juicy funding, which helps keeps their costs down. So that's part of what you'll have to navigate. We should also make a distinction between university-affiliated PsyD programs and professional school programs. So university-affiliated PsyD programs tends to be more funding, smaller class sizes. At professional schools, they're taking bigger class sizes, harder to get funding, less personal attention. Pros and cons to both, though. And let me give you a particular caution about for-profit schools. So some of these professional schools that offer PsyD programs are for-profit schools. You got to be very cautious and make sure you know what you're getting into, and that the people who graduate with a degree with a PsyD from a for-profit professional school can get licensed and get jobs. And you want to make sure that you only go to accredited programs. So I can go into more detail on this stuff during Q&A, Zach and I can, but those are the essentials. Regardless of whether you apply to PhD or PsyD, in clinical or counseling, you want to attend either an APA accredited program, which most are, or a PC-SAS accredited program, which is specific to those clinical scientist PhD clinical psych programs I mentioned. So generally APA is the more dominant accreditation system, but PC-SAS is up and coming. And if you want to provide clinical services, meaning like psychotherapy assessment, after you earn your PhD or PsyD, you're going to need to apply for licensure in the state where you want to work. You got to apply to the Board of Psychology, which is completely separate from the Board of Counseling and the Board of Marriage and Family Therapy, et cetera. And just so you know, some people who graduate with their PhD or PsyD are going to need to spend up to an additional year earning additional supervised clinical hours, seeing additional clients and being supervised in that before they can become fully independently licensed themselves. So it's not like you get the degree and then boom, you can go off on your own and see clients by yourself. Nuh-uh. You have to get licensed, and there's some hoops to jump through, and that's on a state-by-state basis. I'm licensed in Kentucky. I'm not legally able to practice anywhere else. I would have to get licensed in those states first to be able to provide psychotherapy services. So we're moving right along, getting close to that Q&A. Our last question that we have prepared response for is, what does it take to get in? What I recommend, whether you're going clinical or counseling or both, hopefully both, limit your search to APA accredited programs, probably, unless you're looking for those clinical scientist ones. And APA has an awesome directory. Go to this website. They have a list of they have a database of every single counseling and clinical psych PhD and PsyD program that's APA accredited. You can't go wrong with any of those programs. So use that list and use the search criteria to limit it to the flavor of programs that you want. I also, on my website here, if you go to my Psych grad school portion of my professional webpage, I have a list of good Counseling Psych master's programs. Plenty of good ones are missing from the list, but it has a few that I know are good. So if you're interested in master's programs, whether it's doctoral prep or that 60 credit flavor, you can find some of them there. If you want the master's or the PsyD, you're going to approach finding the right schools to apply to in a certain way. Your primary focus is going to be on finding programs that will give you the skills training and the exposure to the populations and the settings where you want to provide services. So if you want to be a child psychologist, you need to go to a master's or PsyD program that gives you training in child psych and has practica where you can see child clients, right? If you want to become an assessment specialist, make sure you go to a program that offers that form of assessment, right? A lot of the stuff is standardized across clinical and counseling psych programs, a lot of the same courses across all these programs because accreditation requires it, but there are some differences program to program. So if you want the master's or the PsyD, you're looking for the right program. In contrast, if you're going for the PhD, for most PhD programs, they use an apprentice model where you're applying to a program, but you're also applying to work with a specific professor at that program. So what you need to do if you're looking for PhD programs to apply to, you need to figure out first what your research interests are. You have to know what research topics are of most interest to you, and then apply to the types of programs that you like where they have a professor there, where you can be research mentored by that professor who researches that topic. And you're going to have to sell them in your application on why they're a good fit. for you and your interests. And of course, make sure the wider program is a good fit for your larger career goals. Zach, I think you have an example of how you approach this.
Yeah, and this is so different from a lot of PhD programs in general. And so it's kind of surprising to me, but basically I made an Excel sheet and I looked up all the professors I had ever cited in research that looked a little similar. And I had a few mentors that I reached out to give me some advice on who did similar research that I wanted to. Not the exact same research, of course, but something I could see myself doing for 5 years minimum, that I could also build a dissertation from their research interests and the intersection of my research interests.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. That's great. So I have an exciting announcement. You all are the first to hear of this publicly, but my team here at the University of Kentucky has finished putting together a huge Google spreadsheet database of a lot of the professors at most of the APA accredited counseling psych PhD and PsyD programs and what their interests are. And so the link to that is down at the very bottom of the slide, but just go to the Psych grad school portion of my website and you'll see that in the drop-down menu. But it can really be useful because if you're curious, what type of research do counseling psych professors do? This is a one-stop shop where you can look through this big list of a bunch of the professors in these programs and what sort of stuff they research. And that can help you as you're looking for potential programs, possibly if you're looking for PhD programs and apprentice model programs. It's a great place to skim through people's research interests to identify professors who do the type of research you're interested in and might want to work under, and you may not have known that they existed because sometimes it's hard to find this information on people's websites. So it's a super cool resource. We're doing a soft launch of it right now. We'll be making improvements to it over time and corrections, but I think it'll be super useful to some of you. So feel free to spread the word to the students who you know. One caveat before we leave this slide, not all PhD programs are apprentice model. Some of them look to instead recruit a group of people who are just good, strong group of applicants, and then they will pair them post hoc once they're in the program to professors who they have a reasonably good overlap with. And so it's less about matching you to a professor strictly on interests, and it's more about bringing in a group of people. So there are those types of programs. And so this sort of using research to find them applies less. So just that caveat. Okay. I want to advance my slide. Okay, so I think this is our last slide before we're going to jump into Q&A. What does a strong counseling psych PhD applicant look like? And then I'll let you know how this applies to PsyDs thereafter. Have a decent GPA, 3.5 or above, fine, right? And I should say that this is what a strong applicant looks like. I didn't look like all of this when I was applying. This is something for us collectively to aspire to. You don't have to check all the boxes. I just want to give you something to strive towards, all right? So there's that caveat. There's still plenty of people who get into counseling psych PhD programs who don't meet all these things, okay? So decent GPA, decent GRE is nice, but increasingly psychology, including counseling and clinical psych, are recognizing that the GRE is very culturally biased and socioeconomically biased. It's not very fair. And so a lot of programs are making the GRE optional, or they're even getting rid of it entirely. For example, our program, a bunch of our programs right now nationally are optional. You can provide it if you want, but you don't have to, and you will not at all be penalized if you don't, which is a good thing, personally, I think. So if you're going to apply to programs and none of them require the GRE, don't waste your time and your money. Don't do it, right? Because the GRE is a pain in the butt. What else should you have on your CV? Regardless of PhD or PsyD programs in clinical or counseling, you should have at least one solid helping experience, some sort of internship or externship or volunteering opportunity or community service thing or advocacy, something where you used your human skills, your people skills, your basic listening skills in a supervised setting where you had some sort of boss or supervisor. because these are the raw ingredients. These basic listening skills are the raw ingredients of what makes a good psychologist. And so we want to see that you did one or multiple, ideally, experiences like that. And that's true for PsyD or PhD. For PhDs, being a research assistant, I encourage you to get involved in at least 2 undergrad research positions in 2 different labs. And at least one of them, ideally, you can work for 2 or more semesters so that you can build trust with them and get handed more advanced tasks to do. Because the more advanced stuff and the more complex stuff you can work on, the cooler it will look on your CV, the more it shows doctoral programs that, hey, this person is doing tasks that grad students do. And so I think they'll be ready for that transition into graduate school. It's even nicer if you can do a senior thesis, independent research project, or present a poster or co-present or be an author or co-author on a paper. This is icing on the cake. This helps the strongest applicant stand out. You don't need to have done this to get into a Counseling Psych PhD or PsyD program, but it's lovely when you can. Because again, it's the sort of independent work that is what grad students do. So we like to see that. You know, probably, you're going to need 3 letters of rec when you apply to a PhD or PsyD program in Counseling Psych. And this is true for Clinical Psych too. Generally, you want the first letter of rec to come from one of your research labs. The second letter of rec should come from the supervisor of that helping experience, who can speak to your good raw ingredients, your good people skills, your good listening skills, your good cultural humility skills. And then your third letter is flexible. It can be from any of those sources. And then it's particularly for Counseling Psych programs, both PhD and PsyD, we really prioritize awareness, interpersonal awareness, emotional intelligence, and cultural awareness. You don't have to be DEI experts, but you need to be open to unlearning some things and learning some new things and being open to experiences and challenging your beliefs and all that. We want to see that openness in how you articulate your written materials. And I should mention that for PsyD programs, it's a good idea to have at least 1 research lab experience, even if that is not the focus of a PsyD. It provides some good breadth. But do you need to do more than 1 research lab to get into a PsyD program? Probably not. Okay. And again, I can get into more details on this later. I'm going to skip this so that we can get right to Q&A questions, but we can come back to the slide if it's necessary, some application tips and some interview tips that I think are super important for people to know. So we can go back to those slides if we want, but we made great time. It's 12:35 Eastern Standard. I've shown you the stuff you need to see, so we're going to open it up to Q&A. Before I do that, please go to that link and check out all the resources I have. Everything I've told you here is in another video or a written source in that section of my website. I have countless hours and countless pages of advice on everything related to grad school, including stuff specific to Counseling Psych. One of the things I'm most proud of is my mental health professions career test. It's been taken by 44,000 people, and it gives you scores on 21 different mental health occupations that might be a good fit for you, including Counseling Psych and Clinical Psych, so you can consider various options. People really like that. Division 17, as Zach mentioned, the Society of Counseling Psych, it's a professional organization. Go check out the website. If you happen to be a UK student, with most of you are not, but if you are, come work in my research lab as an RA, come be an intern in my helping skills internship experience. Good options for UK students. So it is time. So go ahead. Some of you are already posting questions to the chat. We'll start going through those. For those of you who have additional questions, keep popping them in there. We're going to get to as many as we can. And if you have a question that's really hard to type, it's best asked verbally. You can type in, I have a verbal question about, and then let us know what the general topic is. If we have the opportunity in the space, we will call on you. And in that case, you would have our permission to unmute in that specific case. And also a point of etiquette. Concise factual questions work best for this Q&A. Super specific and idiosyncratic questions to your specific context, I will answer them, but just submit them via that link and I'll get back to you, right? So let's try and prioritize those concise factual questions that other people in this call will find useful. right? But we'll seek to answer as many as we can. And so let's take a look at the chat. So Jordan said, hi, I have a question. Maybe, yeah. So I have a question. I'm looking to become a licensed therapist. Is a counseling psychology master's program suitable for that? Is CACREP accredited? So counseling psych master's programs, like all psychology programs, will never, ever be CACREP accredited. So if you live in a state where you want to become a counselor, just do a master's degree and become a counselor, and that state is a CACREP only state that says you have to have gone to a CACREP counseling program, you better only go to a CACREP counseling program if you're going to practice in that state. However, if you know you're going to live and work in a state that is not strictly only allowing CACREP, it says you can go to a counseling psych master's program, that's cool too, then yeah, a 60 credit 3-year counseling psychology master's program can be a great fit. So that's the confusing caveat. What is the difference between this counseling psychology master's program and a clinical mental health counseling master's program? Yeah, counseling psychology master's program is a psychology degree, and clinical mental health counseling master's program is a counseling degree. And if you want the counseling degree, if you're going to get a counseling degree, make sure you get a CACREP accredited counseling degree, because you can get your master's, you can stop there, and you can provide talk therapy. But if you want the perks that comes with a doctorate in counseling or clinical psych, you want to make more money, you want more career options, you want assessment and testing training, clinical supervision, greater prestige to allow you to do fancier things, then a doctorate, a PhD or a PsyD is going to be more helpful. A counseling psych master's program, if it's a doctoral prep program, can help springboard you into such programs, but otherwise consider the CACREP stuff I said. It's state by state. What can you do with a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and how does it differ from related degrees? You can do talk therapy with a master's in clinical mental health counseling. In fact, let me show you this slide. This may be helpful. After your psych bachelor's, you can follow any of these arrows. You can go become a counselor, there in the yellow, 3 years of master's plus some years of being supervised before you can become a licensed professional counselor. You can go into social work, get a 2-year master's degree, and then spend some additional years getting supervised experience and become a licensed clinical social worker. Social work is good for those people who want talk therapy training, plus casework training and training to be a part of an organization that helps address systems of oppression and helps pair people who have needs financially, medically, food-wise, housing-wise, with resources they need. They work in nonprofits and governmental agencies. You'll get that training too. Social work is good for that. Counseling is good if you just want a master's and you want to do talk therapy. Marriage and family therapy is like counseling, but as you might guess from the name, it has a specific focus on couples and relationships and family dynamics. So if that's your jam, you want to do talk therapy stuff specifically with couples and families, an MFT is great. So 2 to 3 year master's degree, plus getting a little bit more supervised experience post-degree, then you become a licensed marriage and family therapist. Psychiatry is good. You can be an MD or a DO, or you become like an advanced psychiatric nurse. If you want to, if you like the physical health stuff, the medical stuff, you don't mind organic chemistry, right? If you become a doctor, if you become a psychiatrist, which is a medical doctor who specializes in mental health, a doctor that specializes in mental health, you can prescribe medication in addition to doing some therapy if you want. But psychiatrists don't get deep training in talk therapy. They don't have time. They have to be experts on the medical biological stuff. So if you really like talk therapy, you might consider some of these other professions. But if you really also want to be able to prescribe mental health medications, psychiatry is a good option, assuming you don't hate organic chemistry, which I do, which is why I didn't go into psychiatry. Psychology, we've talked about PhD versus PsyD, with that little caveat of in some states that are not CACREP only states, you can get a 3-year 60 credit master's in counseling psych or potentially clinical psych. And sometimes in some states, those boards of psychology will say, yeah, come on over. We'll license you as a psychologist, even though you got a psych master's degree. So that hopefully that slide helps with that. Look at the questions. Let's see, where did we pick back up? What would you say to someone who is worried about not making enough money with a master's? I'm not particularly worried about it, but my mom doesn't think I can make enough. It's dependent on what sort of quality of life, like how much money do you spend to do the things and get the food in your mouth that you want. There's a ton of counselors in the world. There's a ton of counselors in America, and they do just fine. So if you want a high class standard of living, yeah, you may want to make more money, but there are plenty of people who make fine money. And counselors vary. If you get a lot of experience as a counselor, if you develop a niche for a particular population, you're really good at it, you're good at marketing, you have a good website, you can make good money. Some counselors make just as much money as psychologists do. But in general, yeah, the salaries are a bit lower. So it depends on what sort of stuff you like to buy and how expensive it is. What would a student's path look like if they want to teach undergraduate psychology? If you want to teach undergraduate psychology, you want a PhD. And then whether you get a clinical psych PhD or a counseling psych PhD depends on which philosophy, and remember that slide with the tendencies, which set of things you like better, or what type of research that you want to do. Because if you want to research stuff that a bunch of counseling psychologists tend to research, you should be a counseling psych professor, or vice versa for clinical psych. Now, of course, remember, there are other flavors of psychology. There's school psychology. They can get licensed too in some cases. They work in the schools. They do a lot of counseling and clinical psyche stuff. You've got industrial, organizational, cognitive, social, developmental. You've got stuff where they're not trained as mental health professionals. They don't do therapy stuff, but they teach and they do research. So if you just want to teach and do research and you don't want to touch therapy stuff, consider the other specialties in psychology. What else? Would it be possible you send the link to the chat? Yeah, Madison asked about providing the links. I will find a way to share the links, or what it will be is I'll share the recording, and so you can just see the links in the recording once it gets posted. Because I'm a little hesitant to share the PowerPoint because of the intellectual property considerations. Oh yeah, thanks, Zach. Perfect. Difference between counseling psych and school psych. Yeah, so school psychology is good if you want to work with kids or adolescents and you want to work with them in schools usually. You can get an EDS, which is a secret middle degree between a master's and a PhD. You can get an EDS, which takes about half the ways between, like 3 to 4 years. And then you can do school psychology stuff, some talk therapy, but honestly, mostly assessment and case management in school settings. But if you want to be independently practicing outside of a school setting, you'll want a PhD in school psychology. And I don't think PsyDs in school psych exist. I think it's just PhDs or EDSs. So school psych is good if you want to work with kids, especially in schools. What type of master's program or PhD program would it take to be a school counselor? A school counseling master's program, which would be under here. It's one flavor of counseling. There are also some non-CACREP school counseling programs that can work, but I'm at the edge of my expertise. I can't give you too much advice on that. You'll want to talk to some professors in school counseling programs to get their take on that. What would you suggest for international students who intended to go back to their home countries to have their career? What kind of resources can they refer to for considering transform the degree or certification? Yeah, that is tough. And I personally don't have a lot of resources specific to international students. I have a few videos about it. I'm less familiar with really good, I think you'll probably want to go to your country of origin or the country where you want to live outside the US, go to see what their mental health professions are and what societies or organizations or professional organizing or accrediting bodies exist. And their websites will have information about what are their requirements for licensure in that country and what sort of degree preparation do you need. And then you can think about, would US-based degrees translate well for what that country expects? But in general, US degrees are pretty well regarded internationally. And especially if you get a doctorate, a PhD especially, you're going to have some pretty good transferability generally back to your home countries. It's less certain when you get PsyDs or master's degrees, because it really varies country to country. So it is tricky, and we don't do well with international coordination. So sorry, I can't be more specific with that. How important is regular GPA versus major GPA on graduate school application? What is the expectations for major GPA versus normal GPA? Zach, do you want to speak to this, or do you want me to take this?
I don't have a lot of expertise, but from my understanding, your major GPA is the more important. Your psych GPA is going to be more important than your regular GPA. What is the expectation for making versus normal? I don't know about a major versus normal, but I just know in general having a high psych GPA or major GPA is preferred.
Yeah, I would say that when people mention their GPA, but then their major GPA, when they separate it out, it's because their major GPA is higher and it makes them look better. And we understand that, right? Like if your major GPA happens to be lower than your general GPA, don't even talk about your major GPA, right? You want to, like, people will report major GPA because they're like, I took a bunch of organic chemistry and it tanked I got C's, but now I'm on the right path. Like, that's why they mentioned major. So, if your major GPA is 3.5 or above, great. You can be okay if it's greater than 3.0 sometimes, but 3.5 or above is a safe bet. We don't parse too much above 3.5. That's kind of, if you're above 3.5, we tend to look at other things to give it more weight overall. Someone asked back channel, I'm not exactly sure what I want to do with my degree yet. How would you recommend figuring that out? I want to do with my degree yet, with like your psychology bachelor's degree. Yeah, that is tough. I would take my mental health professions career test and then sit on those results and contemplate them. That would be a sensible first step to help give you a sense of direction. Could you teach at a university with a PsyD rather than a PhD? Wonderful question. You can teach at a university with a PsyD often. So some programs really prefer that you have a PhD, especially if that program wants to make sure you have good training as a researcher. Because remember, PsyD people are trained to consume research, not to produce it. And so a lot of psych programs want to hire people who are scientists, as well as, in the case of counseling or clinical psych, fully trained practitioners, right? So PhD is safer, especially if you want to teach undergraduates in a psychology department. However, if you want to teach at a PsyD program, or you want to teach in a department that teaches graduate students how to be therapists, master students and doc students, a PsyD can be a good fit because you'll be really good teaching that, right? But if part of the expectation is you need to do research, then a PhD is safer. So that's the nuance. We're getting towards the end of the questions and we're right on time. This is wonderful. So if you have more questions, keep them coming. We might be able to squeeze them in. Do spring senior year extracurriculars, research lab work, independent projects, et cetera, matter much when we're applying to grad schools the fall, our senior year? Well, what helps, you apply for doctorates in October, November, right, of the fall of, say, your senior year. And so whatever you've done up until that point, you get to talk about and brag about in your CV and your personal statement. So stuff that's going to happen after that time, you can only promise that you're going to have that experience, but it doesn't feel as meaty. So I'm not sure if I'm precisely answering the question. So if you want to reword that and I'll refield it, that's okay. This is an important time to mention a difference between counseling psych and clinical psych. If you're not yet strong enough to get into a counseling psych doctorate, do a 2-year doc prep master's degree like ours at the University of Kentucky. However, if you want to go into only clinical psych programs and you're not quite yet strong enough for a clinical psych PhD or PsyD, instead of doing a master's, generally you want to consider a post-bac position, a post-bachelor's 1-year or 2-year position where you work in someone's research lab, hopefully being paid, as like a lab manager or something, to get additional experience. Usually you're trying to get additional research experience. Usually that's where people fall short on their CVs. So it's more common in clinical psych to do a post-bac and then get into a doctorate. Whereas in counseling psych, getting a master's is more popular if you need some more time to build up your CV. What does a job as an industrial organizational psychologist look like? I'm not one, so it's harder for me, but they do a lot of consultation with businesses and organizations around helping organizations, businesses, and groups be a healthier environment and be a more productive environment. So it's like it had some human relations, human resources, HR pieces. They look at how do we boost productivity, well-being, retention, stuff like that. And they do research that is at the intersection of psychology and business. So it's applied, but it's not in a therapy sort of way. Donnie gives a shout out to the mental health professions career test. Thank you. Were you implying on the earlier slide that you do not have to be a student at UK to be in your research lab? I very occasionally will take a student on a volunteer non-credit basis into the Hammer Research Lab because we can do that in the age of Zoom. But the student needs to be pretty strong because I have students on campus who generally are prioritized at UK Psych undergrads. But it is possible. I have done it in the past. Thank you for that question. Do you discourage taking a year off in between undergrad and grad school? No, there is no one will ever penalize you for not going straight into a degree. But here's the thing you need to keep in mind. When you're out of school, you get a little rusty, right? That's just a thing. And so taking a gap year is good if the gap year is a combination of good for your mental health and whatever else, but also you're staying productive. Take a gap year if you're willing to do some stuff, do some helping experiences with AmeriCorps, volunteer in a research lab, volunteer in a community agency. Like a gap year that is productive in building your CV as well as taking care of your mental health is good. If you're sitting on your butt streaming YouTube, that's not good, right? They're going to see a gap in your CV. They'll be like, what's going on? Last question. Is it easier to get licensed in the state that you go to graduate school in, or is it just as easy to move to a different state and get your license there? Generally, it's just as easy to move around. Yeah. Some states have slightly different requirements for licensure. So you do want to know what state are you likely to end up in, know what their licensure requirements are, whether you're going to be talking with the Board of Psych or the Counseling Board or whatever, but know what their requirements are and make sure the things you're doing in school, in your state, in your program, are matching up with that. For example, California requires, I think, a class in maybe substance abuse, and I think maybe like couples marriage stuff. And that's not necessarily an APA accreditation requirement for most counseling psych and clinical psych programs. And so you might want to ensure that you get to take that class, hopefully at your institution, if you want to get licensed there. So yeah. What are some characteristics of a program that values DEI that students should look for? That they walk the talk. Talk with their students, because it's easy for professors and students to some degree. It's easy for people to say they value a thing. So you really want to look for concrete examples that they do value it. Where do they publish? How do they publish? Is their research culturally sensitive? Is it attentive to those pieces? Does it name those pieces in what they publish? What do they do research on? Is it stuff that's centers DEI? What do they, if you can get a hold of the syllabi, do they center DEI and emphasize DEI and how they teach the stuff they teach? What do they say on their website? What organizations and task forces and service stuff do their professors do? So look for evidence that they walk the walk, because there's a pressure in both clinical and counseling psych to say that we value stuff, but then programs vary in how much they follow through on that. So especially talking with the students and be like, hey, how are they around this stuff? You'll get the straightest answer from students. Zach, what would you say about this?
Yeah, I definitely agree with looking at all the resources, talking to students, and looking at what type of research the faculty members do. Are they all researching similar things? Do they research social justice things? How much have they published? So stuff like that.
Yeah. So This is amazing. We have 3 minutes left. Did we get to all of your questions? We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more. This is your chance. And while folks are thinking about, so Zach, why don't you keep an eye on the chat? I'm going to take a moment, if I can pull this off, to show folks something. Yeah. Okay, so now Zach, is this, are they seeing my website here? Cool beans. So, so this is the section I was talking about, Psych Grad School. And it has all these sub pages, and this graduate school advice section is where I have the big list of all the stuff. So this is the one-stop shop. I have a lot of resources, both mine and the best resources I found other places, all linked to from here. So getting into grad school, lots of stuff, lots of resources on that, thriving in graduate school, etc. So there's a lot of stuff on this web page. You know, this will be familiar. I go into more depth on what does the ideal doc applicant look like, go into much more depth there. I have a much more in-depth comparison of counseling psych versus clinical psych here. The mental health professions career test that's been taken by those 44K plus people is right here. Some advice on what makes a best doctoral program in counseling psych. I go into a lot of detail about the things you want to look for. So that question about DEI, I get at some of that cultural diversity. I talk about what makes for a good program, that listed master's program. I analyzed personal statement requirements for counseling psych, and I give you some suggestions for what to write about in your statement of purpose. I have a like 4.5 hour how to get into a counseling psych PhD program YouTube video series that's really in depth. You can ask me a question here. Here's that counseling psych faculty research interests list. So you hit the landing page and you click here, and here are the 650 plus counseling psych professors and all the APA accredited programs listed out with their website, where they're at, their name, their title, linked to the info where we copy and pasted their research interests to. So a lot of fun stuff you might consider. So we are at time. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to follow up with me back channel through my website for additional questions you have. And please share the link to the recording of this with your friends and with other psych majors and your advisors. Help spread the word about this if you found it useful. And yes, you're very welcome. And I hope to see some of you applying to our doctoral prep master's program. It's really good. So I look forward to seeing your applications and maybe even to our doc program if that's a good fit. So goodbye, y'all. Thank you again.